Tonight, let us wander into a world where the sky cleared over a Belgian field, a world where the fate of a continent turned on a gentler breeze. Close your eyes and follow that breeze back to a June morning in 1815. The air is thick with the promise of rain that never quite falls. The mud is deep, yes, and the tension is a palpable hum, but imagine now a different cloud passing over. A dispatch is delayed by a muddy lane. A cavalry commander hesitates, seeing a shadow in a copse of trees that is only a deer. A simple shift, a breath held a moment longer, and so the charge that history remembers as fatal falters. And the man on the gray horse, watching from the ridge, allows himself a slow, deliberate nod. The day is 18th day of June, is his. Picture this world now not through the lens of cannon smoke, but through the soft, dappled light of the years that follow. The news travels not as a shock, but as a sigh, a long, continental sigh of resignation, and then, curiously, of relief. The Congress of Vienna, that grand assembly of kings and diplomats stitching the old order back together, finds its needle suddenly threaded with a different color. The peace that is signed in the autumn of 1815 is not the peace of total victory, but the peace of a balance, recalibrated. Napoleon Bonaparte returns not to exile, but to Paris, to the Tuileries Palace, under a canopy of autumn leaves that crunch softly under the wheels of his carriage. He is an emperor, yes, but an emperor of a negotiated reality. France keeps its natural borders, the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees. A buffer of friendly states like the Kingdom of the Netherlands remains. But their courts now look to Paris for cultural guidance, not just to Vienna or London for political permission. And so, slowly, like the first gentle drops of rain after a long drought, a new influence begins to seep into the soil of Europe. It is not the hard stamp of conquest, but the softer pressure of cultural gravity. The Code Napoleon, that clear, rational structure of laws, becomes the common text for legal reform, from Brussels to Warsaw to Turin. Young men of good family no longer make just the grand tour to Italy. They make the voyage impérial to Paris, to study its principles of administration, to walk its wide new boulevards lined with chestnut trees. They return home with books, with ideas, with a taste for a certain style of architecture that favors grand, airy spaces and clean, classical lines. Imagine a street in a city like Cologne, 2 decades after that day at Waterloo. The cathedral still stands, a work in slow, perpetual progress, but around it, new buildings rise. They are of pale local stone, but their design is Parisian, mansard roofs of slate that gleam like fish scales in the soft rain. Tall windows that let in the low, golden light of the Rhineland. The shop signs are in German, but the fashions in the window, the high-waisted gowns for women, the simpler, darker coats for men, speak of a French aesthetic. In a café, the smell of roasted coffee and fresh ink fills the air. A young man reads a newspaper printed on a sleek iron-frame press, a technology shared freely from French workshops. The news is of railway lines, planned to connect Mainz to Strasbourg, and then Strasbourg to Paris. The world is being drawn closer, not by the march of armies, but by the steady chug of locomotives and the laying of smooth iron rails. Let us follow one such life, a single thread in this vast, slowly turning tapestry. Her name is Elise. She is born in a small town in Lorraine in 1830, the year the first passenger railway in this world steamed smoothly from Paris to Lyon. Her father is a civil engineer, a graduate of the École Polytechnique, and his work is the gentle reshaping of the continent. He designs bridges, elegant arched stone bridges over rivers, and iron trestle bridges for the railways that are stitching the French sphere together. Elise's childhood is a nomadic one, a series of rented rooms in quiet provincial towns near construction sites. Her memories are not of grand events, but of sensory details. The feel of cool, polished limestone under her small hand, as her father explains the Keystone Principle. The sound of workmen singing folk songs in the evening, their voices mingling with the calls of swallows. The smell of her mother's lavender sachets, always tucked into trunks between moves. Her personal world is shaped by the peaceful Imperium. She attends a lycée for girls, an institution promoted by the imperial administration that believes in the rational education of all citizens. She learns mathematics, history, and the poetry of Lamartine, whose verses speak of melancholy lakes and autumnal feelings, perfectly suited to the reflective mood of this era. At 17, her father's work takes the family to Brussels. She walks through the newly laid-out Parc de Bruxelles, modeled on the Bois de Boulogne, and feels a sense of familiar strangeness. The language around her is Flemish and French, the architecture a blend of Old Gothic and New Neoclassical. She writes in her journal bound in green Moroccan leather, "It is as if Paris has breathed upon this place, and its breath has taken physical form in stone and tree." Elise falls in love with a Belgian cartographer, a quiet man named Luc, who is engaged in the great project of mapping, with exquisite precision, the roads, canals, and new rail lines of this consolidated Europe. Their courtship is conducted in Parisian French, over cups of chocolate and plates of buttery pastries. They marry in a simple civil ceremony, as is the growing fashion, their union recorded in a ledger based on the code. Their life is one of quiet contribution. Luc's maps guide the commerce, the Belgian lace, the French wine, the German machinery that flows with increasing ease. Elise, using her education, helps him with the lettering and the delicate coloring of borders, which are now more often administrative than militarized. In the lamplight of their apartment, the world is reduced to a beautiful, ordered series of lines and hues, a promise of knowable, manageable space. As the decades turn, like the heavy, well-oiled pages of a large atlas, the world evolves. Napoleon I passes in his bed at the Palace of Fontainebleau in 1842, an old man who saw his legacy become one of institutions rather than battlefields. His son, raised in this atmosphere of stable, enlightened administration, ascends as Napoleon II. The era is not without its tensions. There are stirrings of national feeling in the German states, whispers of democracy in London, but the great European war, the cataclysm that once seemed inevitable, never coalesces. The energy of the age is channeled elsewhere. It goes into the crystal palaces of great exhibitions, where French-designed steam engines hum peacefully beside British looms and Bohemian glass. It goes into the laboratories, where a spirit of scientific inquiry, fostered by state-sponsored academies, leads to discoveries in medicine and chemistry shared freely across borders. The electric telegraph, when it arrives, strings its wires along the railway cuttings, carrying news and private messages, making the continent feel like a single, murmuring room. Elise and Luc grow old in a world that feels progressively smaller and brighter. They see gaslight replace oil lamps on the boulevards of Brussels. They receive a daguerreotype from a cousin in Milan, a startlingly clear image of the Duomo, captured on a silvered plate. They take a holiday, via a series of smooth rail journeys, to the shores of Lake Geneva. Sitting on a balcony, wrapped in shawls, they watch the moonlight lay a path of shimmering silver across the dark water. Elise thinks of the ripples from a single stone, cast into the center of a pond long ago. The stone was a decision, a moment on a muddy field. The ripples spread outwards, touching shores far distant, rearranging the reflection of the stars on the surface of history. Her life, Luc's life, the lives of millions, are those rearranged reflections, gentle and full of a quiet pattern. The century wanes. The style of art changes from the clean lines of Empire classicism to the softer, more nostalgic strokes of what is called reverie, a style of painting that favors hazy landscapes, quiet domestic interiors, and a sense of peaceful, fleeting time. It is the perfect art for this alternate century, an art of calm reflection. In a gallery in Vienna, a painting shows an old woman, much like Elise in her final years, sitting by a window, mapping documents spread before her, a single shaft of afternoon sun illuminating the dust motes and the faded ink. The title is simply The Cartographer's Wife, 1889. And so we come to the edge of this world, to the twilight of the 19th century. The airship, a graceful, silent craft of silk and lightweight frame, drifts over a Europe at peace. From its gondola, one can see the patchwork of fields, the dark lines of forests, the silver threads of rivers and rails, all under a blanket of quiet, starry night. There are no great glaring cities of frantic industry, but a constellation of well-lit, orderly towns, connected by the steady, rhythmic pulse of transport and telegraph. The philosophy that dominates the salons and universities is one of harmonious progress, a belief that human reason, codified and shared, can build a world that avoids the old cliffs of chaos and war. Tonight we have wandered through this gentle possibility, a world built on a single, shifted moment. A world where the legacy of an emperor was measured not in fallen monuments, but in the spread of wide boulevards, in the clarity of legal codes, in the soft diffusion of a certain light through a certain style of window. It is a world that chose, or perhaps was guided toward, a different kind of tide. Not a tidal wave of conflict, but the slow, inevitable tide of cultural exchange, rising quietly, lifting all the boats in its harbor. As you drift toward sleep, picture that tide. Feel its gentle, rhythmic pull. See the moonlight on its calm surface, a path leading to a horizon of quiet dreams. In this world, and in all possible worlds, peace is a landscape we can choose to imagine, to cultivate in the gardens of our minds. Thank you for dreaming with us tonight. Sleep well. The years, like loops meticulously drawn isobars on a weather chart, continued their steady, silent procession. Elise passed first, in the spring of 1891, not with a gasp, but with a slow exhalation, like the last scent of lavender from a sachet tucked away in a drawer. She died in the same Brussels apartment where they had spent 40 years. The morning sun patterning the floorboards through the tall windows, a half-finished cup of tisane cooling on the table beside her mapping stool. Luke followed her within the year, as if he had merely been completing a final essential survey, the charting of a world that no longer held her coordinates. Their only child, a daughter named Sophie, cleared the apartment. Among the books and papers, she found a small locked box of rosewood. Inside were not jewels, but her mother's journals, bound in their green leather, and a collection of her father's preliminary sketches, not the official maps, but the delicate observational drawings he made on sight. The curve of a willow looming over a canal in Bruges, the intricate geometry of a half-built railway station's iron lattice, the way the light fell on a particular stretch of cobbled street in autumn. Sophie, who had become a curator at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, understood. These were not just records, they were the sensory archive of an era. She spent her own twilight years compiling, annotating, and eventually donating the collection. It found a home not in a museum of war or history, but in a museum of daily life, a quiet, sunlit gallery in Lyon dedicated to the arts de la paix. Sophie's work ensured that the texture of that alternate century was preserved. One could run a finger over the raised ink of Elise's handwriting, describing the taste of a peach from a market in Strasbourg, or the sound of a particular locomotive's whistle, a two-tone call her father had helped design, meant to be less jarring, more melodic than its predecessors. One could study Luke's sketch of a bridge under construction, the workers like tiny, purposeful ants, and see in the margins his notes about the type of local wildflowers that would be replanted on the embankments. This was the quiet heartbeat of the age, a consideration not just for function, but for harmony. The turn of the century arrived not with the bang of a new fearful epoch, but with the soft chime of a clock. The year 1900 was celebrated across Europe with a series of interconnected exhibitions, the grandest in Paris. It was not a display of martial might, but a festival of interconnectedness. The Exposition Universelle, filled the Champ de Mars with a dreamlike city of pavilions, each nation showcasing its arts and industries. The dominant architectural style was Reverie Nouveau, an evolution of the nostalgic Reverie style into something more organic. Flowing lines inspired by vines and water lilies, stained glass that dissolved walls into pools of colored light. The German pavilion, a masterpiece of glass and wrought iron, stood beside the Italian pavilion, a celebration of Carrara marble and frescoed domes, with no sense of rivalry, only of conversation. The great achievement, the symbol of the age, was the Pont Transcontinental, a railway bridge of stunning elegance spanning the Rhine at Cologne. It was not the heaviest or the strongest bridge ever built, but it was widely considered the most beautiful, a delicate tracery of steel that seemed to float above the water, its reflection completing a perfect, airy circle. Its opening ceremony featured no military parades. Instead, a choir of children from every nation it connected stood on the central span, singing a cantata composed for the occasion. Their voices carried by the new technology of radio transmitters to listening posts in Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. The continent paused for a few moments to listen to that clear, united sound over the airwaves. In this world, the 20th century did not dawn with the same existential dread. The great grinding engines of nationalism had been tempered, their sharper edges worn smooth by decades of shared legal frameworks, interlinked economies, and a common cultural lingua franca, centered on the ideals of the Enlightenment, as interpreted and disseminated from Paris. Of course, trade negotiations that grew tense, diplomatic spats over colonial territories in far-off lands where the European model was being gently and often problematically applied. But the mechanisms for resolution were robust, ingrained. The Cour de Concorde Européenne, established in The Hague, was a busy and respected institution. Its justices, robed in deep blue, settled disagreements over river rights and patent law with the dry, meticulous language of the Code Napoleon. Technology advanced, but its character was different. Without the terrible, accelerating pressure of total war, innovation unfolded at a more contemplative pace. The internal combustion engine was developed, but primarily for agriculture and personal carriages, which remained a luxury. The skies by the 1910s were commonly graced by the silent, drifting forms of passenger airships, traveling between the spires of city center terminals. The world's attention was turned outward, to the stars observed through ever larger telescopes in the clear mountain air of Switzerland, and inward, to the mysteries of the human mind explored by philosophers and psychologists in well-funded institutes. Art continued to be the mirror. Painting moved from reverie into a style called luminism, obsessed with capturing the subtle, shifting qualities of light at different times of day and in different weathers. The gray pearl of a Brussels dawn, the honeyed thickness of a Provençal afternoon. It was an art of profound peace, of seeing deeply into a moment. Music, too, reflected the times. The grand, tumultuous romanticism of a Beethoven, a product of a more turbulent age, gave way to the impressionistic, textured compositions of a European school that favored clarity, pattern, and a certain serene melancholy. Concert halls were places of quiet, focused listening, not emotional catharsis. An old man, a grandson of Elison Lux, sits now in one such hall in Vienna. His name is Julian. He is a composer. Tonight, a small chamber orchestra is premiering his latest work, Cartography, Suite for Strings and Pianoforte. It is based on his great-grandparents' papers. The first movement, the keystone, is built on a single, repeating solid chord progression, stable and architectural. The second, Lavender and Limestone, is a duet between a violin and a cello. One line fluid and fragrant, the other cool and precise. The third, The Rain on the Rhine, uses the pianoforte to mimic the soft, persistent patter on a window pane, while the strings evoke the river's steady, timeless flow. As the final notes fade, not into silence but into a sustained, shimmering harmonic that seems to hang in the hall's air like mist. Julian closes his eyes. He does not think of emperors or battles. He thinks of the small, human things. He thinks of his great-grandmother's hand, guided by her father's, touching the cool stone of a bridge. He thinks of his great-grandfather's pen, dipping into ink, to trace the path of the new railway that would carry families on holiday. He thinks of the countless unrecorded moments, a shared meal on a train, a letter sent by telegraph, a new idea read in a book printed on a French press and discussed in a Viennese cafe. His music is not about the stone cast into the pond, but about the intricate, beautiful interference patterns in the ripples, the way they eventually lap gently at every shore, rearranging the sand into new, delicate formations. After the performance, he walks home through the quiet, gaslit streets of Vienna. The architecture here is a palimpsest, Baroque grandeur overlaid with the clean lines of French neoclassical, softened further by the organic curves of Reverie Nouveau on the newer buildings. It is a city that has absorbed influences like a sponge, making them its own. He passes a small park where a statue not of a general, but of a composer, Mozart, sits beneath a linden tree, a gentle smile on his bronze face. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant baking bread. He arrives at his apartment, a high-ceilinged space filled with books and musical scores. On his desk, next to a sheaf of manuscript paper, is the small rosewood box. He does not open it tonight. He simply rests his hand on its lid, worn smooth by generations of touch. Outside, the first few stars pierce the velvet gloom. An airship, its running lights a string of soft amber pearls, glides silently overhead, bound for Prague or perhaps Paris. He watches it until it disappears into the night, a perfectly ordinary sight. This is the world that was built on a breath held a moment longer, on a dispatch delayed by mud, on a nod from a man on a gray horse. It is a world with its own pains, its own injustices, its own quiet sorrows. But it is a world that chose at a crucial fork the path of consolidation over conflagration, of cultural seepage over cultural shock. Its legacy is in the width of the streets, in the clarity of the laws, in the very pace of life. A walk instead of a run, a conversation instead of a shout, a piece of music that explores the subtle shades of a single peaceful emotion. As Julien extinguishes his lamp and the room is claimed by the soft darkness, the continent sleeps on. From the Atlantic to the Carpathians, the lights in the windows dwindle, one by one. The night trains glide soundlessly on their tracks, their passengers dozing in their compartments. In the museums, the paintings of hazy landscapes and quiet interiors watch over the empty halls. In the archives, the maps drawn by men like Luke lie flat and still in their drawers, their borders faint, their rivers a steady blue. The tide of that long-ago decision is now a calm, permanent sea, its surface reflecting a sky full of stars, its depths holding the layered, sedimented history of a century of quiet choices. And somewhere, in the space between waking and dreaming, in the gentle hum of a world at rest, one can almost hear it, the faint, enduring echo of a sigh of relief breathed 2 centuries before.